Well, welcome. My name is Tinker, and I am the pastor here at New Covenant United Methodist Church in Farmington, New Mexico. I am so glad you're joining us for worship today, and I hope that you will check out our website at www.newcovenantmethodistnm.org so you can learn more about us. And if you'd like, we can send you our monthly newsletter. Send us an email at ncumcfarmington@hotmail.com, and we'll make sure you get it. When I was 8 years old, I got to take a really neat trip. Grew up on the coastal plains of Texas, and we went to the Rocky Mountains and literally just went up the Rocky Mountains as far north as we could go. We were hoping to maybe even get to Canada. Well, we were moving rather quickly, but trying to see as much as we could along the way. And so we weren't spending but maybe a night or so at each place that we went. And we got to Yellowstone. And we wanted to see as much as we could in the very short period of time that we had. So even though we literally got there right before dark, we went, put some stuff in a campsite to save it for ourselves, and then hopped back in our Mary Myler and headed to Old Faithful. Now, if you're not familiar with a Mary Myler, it's a van that's been converted into a camper. And we made it to Old Faithful. It started getting dark. We got back in the Mary Myler, and there were 6 of us, me and my 2 brothers. I was 8 at the time, my brothers were 6 and soon to be 5. And then we had my grandfather and, of course, my parents. So we get back in the Mary Myler, we head back towards our campground, hoping we could find it in the dark, and we break down. Now, several times a ranger comes past us and tells us to stay out of the woods without realizing we're broken down, so eventually my dad left the hood up so that they would realize that we were actually in trouble, that we were stranded, and they stopped, asked us if they could help. And we said, well, we're broke down, we're not sure what the problem is. My dad was a fairly good mechanic, and my grandfather was a good mechanic, and they had not been able to figure out what was wrong. So they actually had a tow truck, and they towed us back to Old Faithful. Now, this was before they had the new lodge. This was the old one, and they had a mechanic shop there and the back area. And they actually towed us to the parking lot by this mechanic shop so that hopefully maybe between their mechanics and my dad and my grandfather, they could figure out what was wrong, which we worked on the next morning. But he did warn us to not leave food out because they were having some trouble with bears getting into the trash there behind the lodge, and not to just wander. We went to bed the next morning. They were able to figure out what was wrong, and it was our timing chain. It was broke. So we were going to have to order one. Well, this was the days before just everybody used FedEx. If FedEx even existed in 1978, I don't know. And so it took a while for that part to come in. It took several days. And then, come to find out, they had sent the wrong part. So it had to go back, and then they had to send the other part. In the meantime, though, my brothers and I got to roam the back area behind the lodge and the ranger station of Old Faithful. And we had a great time. But we did have limits on what we could do. For one thing, one of the rangers had his horse there, and he didn't want us to scare his horse and to mess around his horse. He had introduced us to his horse, but he had also given us the standard caution that any 8, 6, and 4-year-old should have about playing around horses or scaring his horse. And we couldn't freely roam around on the boardwalk area because there's all this scalding water everywhere. So we had a confined area. Of course, we were worried about grizzly bears. But the neat thing about this little area where we could play is there was a tree that was down, a big, tall, dead ponderosa pine. And being from the coastal area of Texas, we envisioned that it could be a boat. And even though we were confined there in this little area, we could sail the 7 seas by turning that dead tree into a boat. That's exactly what we did. There were some branches still upright on the tree. Of course, it was laying on its side. And then we took some of the dead branches that had come off the tree and we put them along the perimeter, intertwined in the branches that were still on the tree, and kind of shaped a hole out of it, leaving the center kind of open and then just stacking those branches along the side. And then the root base, we actually made that our captain's chair. And we got us a couple of branches that we made a steering wheel out of that was at the top of this captain's chair. Now, I was the oldest, and at that time I was stronger than my two brothers. And so guess who was captain most of the time? Well, me. I felt like it was my right. I was the strongest. It had been my idea. I had done the most work on the ship. And, of course, I was thinking that I was smarter than my brothers. And we had a blast. We played and played on that ship for almost a week, because that's how long it took before we finally got the Mary Myler fixed. As we got ready to leave, my mom realized that that had become Yellowstone for us. Our entire impression of Yellowstone was one trip to Old Faithful, and then playing in that lot with that dead tree and making our boat. So she wanted to take a picture. Well, since I had been captain most of the time, of course, I just figured as soon as we took this picture that I would go grab that captain's chair. That was my rightful place. But to my surprise, my brother, the middle brother, he was 6 at the time, hollered out loud, "I get the captain's chair. I called it." Well, that surprised me. That was my right to have that chair. And it made me mad that he thought he could take my place. And because he was a little bit closer to the tree than I was when my mom said this, he had a jump start on me, and I realized I was going to have a very hard time catching him before he climbed up into the captain's chair, so I tripped him. Just stuck my foot out as we were running and tripped him so that I could beat him to the captain's chair. It was, after all, my place. Well, my mom saw me do it, and she was angry with me, and so to this day, I'm not in that picture. I got to spend the rest of the afternoon in the Mary Myler, all by myself. And my brothers got their picture taken on the boat, but not me. Now, I would love to say that being an 8-year-old, I had learned a great lesson about how I should treat my brothers, but I don't think I did. As a matter of fact, I think I quite frankly remember thinking to myself, well, I won't do that in front of my mom again. Next time, I'll make sure she's not looking. So sadly, I had to be 50 before I learned a better lesson. But I want to tell you about a time where the disciples did something very similar, where they were thinking about tripping each other to be the one in the best spot. So let me read our passage for today. Our passage comes from Mark chapter 9, verses 33 through 37. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent. For on the way they had been arguing with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." This is God's word for God's people. Thanks be to God. So it's helpful when reading this passage to realize where the disciples were, where Jesus was. Jesus had just gone up to the Mount of Transfiguration, and he had chosen to take 3 of the disciples with him, but not the rest. So he took Peter, James, and John with him up there, and just those 3, and then they were up there, and they got to see something incredible. They got to see the other side of Jesus, the more divine side. He was transfigured, that's why we call it the Mount of Transfiguration. He was transfigured before them, and then they got to see what were, for the Jews, the 2 heroes of the faith, Moses and Elijah. So, what an incredible thing going on for them. This change in Jesus where they see He truly is Son of God in a way they haven't yet understood at that point, and still won't totally grasp, but definitely made it a step further than they had been, and Moses and Elijah. They must have felt very special and very excited about it. As they continue now on the trip, and they're walking along and heading back, Jesus is making this big circuit. He's gone up the valley, the Jordan Valley, and then gone back down through Galilee. So he's coming back to Capernaum. He's almost making a circle here. And as he's walking along, he starts to tell the disciples about the fact that he is going to die and then be raised in 3 days. He was going to suffer and die. Clearly, he's trying to get across to them what he's doing, the sacrifice he is making for humanity, but they don't understand. And instead, they begin arguing about who's the greatest. I have no doubt that Peter, James, and John, having just been the three that were chosen to go see something incredible on the Mount of Transfiguration, are probably feeling like they're quite special, that they are the greatest of all the disciples, and that they should have the place of honor. And we have to remember that this is an honor-shame society where honor is incredibly important. To the Jews, honor was everything. It was incredibly important that one maintains their honor. As a matter of fact, if you felt like someone was slighting your honor, revenge was how you fixed it. It's not surprising, actually, that Jesus has so many parables and conversations about not taking revenge, because that was the common way that Jews would deal with the fact if someone shamed them. Because you wanted honor above everything. It was actually more important than money to be honored, to have the best place at the table, to be invited to the best parties. And this wasn't just among the Jews. It was very common, actually, in that area at the time. The Romans even more so. The Romans actually were so into an honor culture, honor-shame society, that should they become shamed in such a way that they did not feel like they could repair their honor, they would actually commit suicide. So honor was incredibly important, and now the disciples are arguing about it, and probably maybe even thinking about tripping each other, as I did to my brother that day. Especially the three. Now the text doesn't tell us the three were thinking they were the greatest. I can't imagine that they weren't, after the fact they had been chosen to go see Moses and Elijah and Jesus transfigured before them. And then they get to Capernaum and they sit down, and Jesus says to them, "Hey, what were you guys arguing about?" And I have a feeling he was walking along and could hear them arguing. And of course, they're now embarrassed. Perhaps they realized, hey, Jesus has been talking about how he's going to suffer and die, and here we are arguing about who's the greatest. And maybe they felt some shame for that. Perhaps they still totally missed understanding what Jesus was saying, that he was going to suffer and die. And they were just ashamed of the fact they were arguing, because Jesus has more than once talked about being a servant to all. So they zip their lips and they don't want to say anything. But Jesus goes on now to explain to them what it means to truly have honor. And he tells them honor is not about being the one in the best chair or having the best place. Honor is actually about remembering what God wants us to do most of all, and that is to love one another as we would want to be loved, to serve one another, to not put our own wants and needs before someone else. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take care of ourselves, but we should be aware of the needs of other people and not constantly put our own needs in front of other people. In other words, we don't trip other people to get the best place. So Jesus teaches them this, and our takeaway today is actually not quite the same as theirs, because they were in this honor-shame culture, and we really aren't. Now, we certainly do have some of that. I mean, honor is still important to people. We still want to be important. We still want to have the best place at stuff, at meals, and, we want to be honored when we go places. But it's not quite as big a deal to us as it was to that culture. So how do we apply it today? Well, you know what's a big deal today? Is being right. We probably do with being right what they did with maintaining their honor. They would do anything to maintain their honor, including the fact that if somebody hurt their honor, they would take revenge. Well, today, it's all about being right. And if someone tells us we're wrong, what do? We fire back. We take revenge. We do everything we can to prove that we are right, even if it takes calling somebody else names to do it. So when we think about what Jesus is teaching today, we need to think about, how do I react when somebody tells me I'm wrong? Or if someone expresses an opinion that I believe is wrong, and I want them to have the right opinion. Do we do as Jesus said and act like a servant? Do we put the other person's honor before our own? Do we do what we can to allow the other person room? A lot of times what we tend to do is fire back. We tend to argue with people. We tend to try very hard to convince them that our position is right, and if they don't accept our position, we decide that they are stupid, uncouth, an idiot, and we begin to use names and labels, and we label those people. We label anybody that doesn't think like we do as wrong. So what Jesus is asking us to do is to give up our seat at the captain's chair. That we don't always have to run and be the person in the picture in the best place. That finding honor is sometimes surrendering that place to allow someone else to sit there, to allow someone else to guide that ship, to allow someone else to be the center of attention, to at least listen to another viewpoint. The second way I see us applying this is to recognize that there are times that we literally end up in the captain's chair just simply by our birth and place in society. And as much as we can, we want to surrender that seat. But when we can't, we need to recognize that we are steering that ship. And how can we steer it to make sure that everyone gets as best a seat as they can? When we are in control, and we recognize that first of all, we have to recognize that we're in control. So if we realize we are the captain of the ship, are we making sure that everyone gets a chance to go where they want to go? Are we making sure that everyone gets a good place to bed, a good place to eat, drink? Are we making sure that we try to put everyone's needs that are on that boat in the agenda, in the itinerary? Are we even listening to where other people want to go? I can tell you when I was 8 and I was driving that imaginary ship with my brothers on board, I doubt I listened to where they wanted to go. But when I did, I think that's when we had the most fun. And how I wish I could go back now and see all three of us in that picture together having a good time. But when we get hung up on driving the boat, sometimes we don't realize how much we're leaving people out and how much more fun we could have. We might be having fun, but we could have so much more fun if we kept everyone in mind. So we need to recognize that being a servant sometimes means that we surrender what could come to us, but it also sometimes means that when we are in a position of leading, that as a servant, we still do our best to make sure that everyone else gets some of the same opportunities. So I pray today that we will all allow everyone else to sit in the captain's chair so everybody can be in the picture. Amen.